They thought it was just an old cabin hidden deep in the woods, a forgotten place with nothing inside. But when investigators stepped through the door, they uncovered a frozen crime scene that had been waiting for decades. In the summer of 1978, New Jersey was a place caught between two eras: the fading industrial power of its cities and the uncertain rise of suburban sprawl, highways threading like arteries between warehouses, small towns, and the looming skyline of New York City in the distance. And it was here, in this particular landscape of smoke-stained factory walls, rusting freight yards, and new glass office blocks, that one of the most audacious and still unsolved heists in American history took place. An event that would come to haunt law enforcement, intrigue journalists, and leave a trail of unanswered questions that even decades later feels like an open wound in the annals of true crime. The object of the crime was not a small-town bank or a jewelry store but an armored cargo facility near Newark Airport, a highly secure depot that served as a transfer hub for international shipments of cash, securities, and precious items flown in from Europe, a place designed to be impregnable, its thick concrete walls reinforced with steel, its entry points guarded by cameras, motion detectors, and armed personnel, its vaults holding sums that in 1978 terms seemed staggering, millions in untraceable banknotes, bearer bonds, and occasionally, though far less documented, crates of diamonds and other stones moving between Antwerp and New York's Diamond District. On the night of August 14, 1978, an estimated $5.2 million vanished from this facility in what authorities would later describe as a near-perfect operation, conducted without a single alarm being triggered and without a single verified eyewitness able to place the culprits inside. The heist, which even hardened investigators would call impossible, seemed to be the work of a phantom, but careful reconstruction of the days and weeks leading up to the crime would reveal it was anything but improvised. It was the product of meticulous planning, access to inside information, and the kind of nerves that only a few men in that world possessed. To understand how it happened, one must first understand the people involved, their motives, and the environment that allowed such an operation to unfold. The supposed mastermind was later believed to be Thomas "Tommy" Brennan, 42 years old at the time, a former dock worker from Bayonne who had risen through the ranks of organized theft rings that specialized in hijacking trucks off the New Jersey Turnpike. Brennan had the look of a man who had spent years under the sun and smoke, heavy-set but agile, with a broken nose from a bar fight in '63 and hands that still bore the calluses of physical labor. He had been out of steady work for years, surviving off small-time rackets, card games, and contacts in the unions, but what separated him from the typical street criminal was his patience and his memory. Brennan had a near-photographic ability to recall details of schedules, routes, and faces, a gift that made him invaluable to crews planning robberies. By the mid-70s, Brennan was facing financial pressure. His marriage was deteriorating, his gambling debts to local bookmakers were mounting, and he was watching younger, hungrier men edge into his old territory. Friends from that period would later testify that Brennan seemed restless, always scribbling notes in a small leather book, muttering about one last big score that would set him straight for life. If Brennan was the planner, the inside man was almost certainly someone like James O'Connor, 33 years old, who worked as a night shift supervisor at the armored facility. O'Connor was an unremarkable man on the surface, clean-shaven, always in pressed shirts, a family man with a wife and 2 children in Elizabeth, but his salary barely covered the bills, and the temptation of watching millions pass under his nose each week had gnawed at him for years. Investigators would later find that O'Connor had begun frequenting a local bar known for mob connections in early 1978, sitting at the far end, nursing his drinks quietly, occasionally seen in whispered conversation with Brennan. Whether he was coerced, bribed, or convinced that he could outsmart the system, O'Connor's role would prove critical, because without his knowledge of shift rotations, alarm reset times, and security blind spots, the job would have been suicide. The preparation began months earlier. Brennan's crew reportedly conducted surveillance on the facility, watching the comings and goings of armored vans, timing the changes in security staff, and even noting the sound patterns of nearby freight trains to determine when outside noise could mask their movements. They rented a garage 2 blocks away under a false name, filling it with tools, spare uniforms, and stolen vehicles with doctored license plates. Through O'Connor, they acquired copies of gate keycards and, most chillingly, a detailed map of the facility's layout, something only a supervisor would have access to. Yet what made the crime so unnerving to investigators later was the precision. They knew exactly which night a shipment of European currency would be sitting in the vault, untransferred until morning, and they knew the security systems would be temporarily vulnerable due to scheduled maintenance on one of the alarms. That kind of information, the FBI would later state, could only come from deep inside the organization. The night of the crime unfolded like a script. At 2:13 a.m., according to facility records, the last scheduled armored van had departed, leaving the vault with approximately $5.2 million in cash slated for transport to banks in Manhattan the next day. Security cameras showed nothing unusual. 2 guards on duty, O'Connor in the control room, perimeter checks conducted at 2:30. At 2:47, however, all footage from the north loading bay camera went dark for exactly 11 minutes. The system recorded no alarm, no forced entry. Yet by 3 a.m., when the camera came back online, the bay door was closed, the guards were at their posts, and the vault appeared untouched. It was not until 6:15, when the morning shift arrived, that anyone realized the vault was empty, its steel door relocked as if nothing had happened. No alarms had been tripped, no guards reported anything unusual, and O'Connor claimed he had been in the control room the entire time, monitoring blankly functional screens. FBI reports later suggested that the crew gained entry using legitimate keycards and passcodes, likely supplied by O'Connor, then subdued the guards without violence, perhaps even with their silent cooperation. The vault itself required 2 keys turned simultaneously, one held by the supervisor, one by the shift lieutenant, yet somehow that mechanism had been bypassed or neutralized. One theory was that Brennan had obtained a copy of the second key through an earlier bribe. Another, more disturbing, was that one of the guards willingly provided it, though none ever admitted as much. What is certain is that the thieves moved quickly. Records show the vault door was open for no more than 9 minutes, time enough to load the cash into canvas bags and wheel them discreetly to a waiting van. No one outside noticed a thing, and by dawn the money was gone, the culprits vanished like smoke. The human element of the crime remains its most fascinating aspect. Brennan, according to later testimony, had insisted on no violence, telling his crew that a dead guard brings the feds down twice as hard. He relied on psychology, intimidation, speed, and the complicity of at least one insider. O'Connor, meanwhile, would later claim he remembered nothing unusual, but FBI analysts pointed to inconsistencies in his timeline and the suspiciously calm tone of his early statements. It was as if he was reading from a script. For the guards, the aftermath was devastating. Careers destroyed, reputations questioned, some accused of complicity though never charged. For O'Connor's family, whispers of his involvement would shadow them for decades. From a procedural perspective, the theft should have been impossible. Security protocols at the time required hourly check-ins, redundant alarms, and locked steel cages within the vault. Yet every safeguard failed simultaneously. Some investigators argued it was pure luck, but most agreed it was an inside job executed with chilling efficiency. The missing money itself only deepened the mystery. None of the stolen bills ever surfaced in circulation, none of the bearer bonds were cashed, and no diamonds were reported missing, suggesting the crew either laundered the assets expertly or stashed them in places never uncovered. As the hours turned into days, the facility became a crime scene swarming with FBI agents, local police, and Treasury officials, all baffled by the lack of physical evidence. Fingerprints were wiped, cameras offered nothing, and even the tire tracks outside were inconclusive. Neighbors reported nothing unusual, though one taxi driver claimed he saw a white van speeding away around 3:15 a.m., yet he could not recall the plate number and the lead went nowhere. Reporters descended on Newark, calling it the crime of the decade, comparing it to cinematic heists, and speculating about mob involvement, foreign syndicates, or even rogue intelligence agents. The truth was no one knew, and in that vacuum legends grew. But while the public gawked at headlines, the individuals inside the story lived with the weight of their choices. Brennan, if indeed the mastermind, now had the problem of what to do with millions in hot cash, each bill traceable, each bond marked. O'Connor, if complicit, had to maintain the appearance of innocence, working shifts under the gaze of suspicious colleagues and federal agents. And the guards, some broken by guilt, others hardened by denial, were trapped in a nightmare where the world believed they had looked the other way. The crime was as much psychological warfare as it was theft, and its aftershocks would ripple for years. What remains haunting even decades later is the sense of something hidden beneath the official record. FBI files declassified in the 1990s mention a sealed envelope of evidence too sensitive to release, including the suggestion of a secondary informant within the facility, someone never charged, perhaps never even questioned publicly. Others point to whispers that part of the loot was not just cash but sensitive documents linked to international banks, papers whose disappearance may have been the true motive, with the money serving as convenient cover. These possibilities keep the story alive, transforming it from a simple heist into a labyrinth of unanswered questions. Part 1 of this story closes in the early morning light of August 15, 1978, when investigators, exhausted and frustrated, stood in the empty vault, staring at steel shelves where millions had sat hours before, asking themselves the same question that lingers today: how could this have happened without anyone noticing, and who among the men they had already interviewed was lying through his teeth? The air was thick with suspicion, and every detail, every misplaced clipboard, every clock that ran 2 minutes slow, suddenly seemed sinister. It was here, in that moment of confusion, that the seeds of paranoia were planted, seeds that would grow as the investigation unfolded, and seeds that ensure we cannot yet close the book on the Newark armored heist of 1978. By the morning after the heist, the Newark facility had become a fortress under siege, not from criminals but from investigators, a swarm of law enforcement and federal officials trying to make sense of an audacious crime that had left them humiliated. And part 2 of this story begins here, with the investigation that unfolded across weeks, months, and eventually decades, leaving a trail of ruined reputations, conspiracy theories, and fragments of truth that never quite came together. The FBI's Newark field office was placed in charge, with Special Agent Raymond O'Donnell, a 46-year-old veteran of organized crime investigations, leading the task force. O'Donnell was known for his meticulous habits, the kind of man who carried 2 notebooks at all times and annotated every conversation. But even he would later admit that the Newark armored heist was unlike anything he had faced, not because of the violence but because of its eerie silence, the absence of alarms, of witnesses, of evidence. The first days of the investigation followed predictable steps. Every employee was questioned, background checks were ordered, and forensic teams combed the facility for fingerprints, fibers, or tool marks. Nothing. The vault door showed no forced entry, the cameras showed no intruders, and the guards all told the same story. Nothing unusual happened between 2:30 and 3 a.m. Yet in their sameness, O'Donnell smelled collusion, or at least coaching, and he began to focus on the possibility of an inside man. James O'Connor's name rose quickly to the surface. As the night shift supervisor, he had both keys and codes, and his calm demeanor during questioning struck some agents as rehearsed. It was like he was trying too hard to act normal, one report noted. But suspicion is not proof, and O'Connor had no sudden deposits in his bank accounts, no lavish purchases, no signs of unexplained wealth. His wife told agents he was anxious, chain-smoking through the nights after the robbery, terrified that the FBI would accuse him unjustly. Yet neighbors recalled seeing him in hushed conversation with a heavy-set man at a bar weeks before the crime, a man who matched descriptions of Tommy Brennan, though no photograph could confirm it. Parallel to the interviews, the FBI conducted a financial investigation, tracing the serial numbers of the stolen bills through banking networks. Every dollar had been recorded, and the expectation was that within days, some of the money would surface. Weeks passed, then months, and not a single note appeared. This was the first major twist in the investigation. The criminals had either laundered the money through channels far more sophisticated than anticipated, or more shockingly, they had never released it into circulation at all, perhaps keeping it locked away. "It's like the money vanished into thin air," O'Donnell told a journalist off the record. "And money doesn't vanish, it moves, it circulates. Unless they had another purpose entirely." That offhand remark would later fuel decades of speculation about whether the theft had been about the money or about something hidden in the vault, something never declared publicly. Technically, the investigation pushed boundaries. In 1978, the FBI did not have modern DNA analysis, but they had advanced fingerprint dusting techniques and chemical residue tests, all of which turned up empty. Agents reconstructed the vault mechanisms, testing how 2 keys could have been turned without both supervisors present. They discovered that with minor adjustments, a copied key could be used if the timing of the lock's tumblers was perfectly synchronized, but such precision suggested either extensive practice or insider knowledge. Surveillance footage was enhanced frame by frame, though the analog tapes of the time were grainy and unhelpful. One blurred frame at 2:46 a.m. showed what might have been a shadow near the loading bay, but experts disagreed on whether it was human or just a fluctuation in the lighting. The investigation also widened to organized crime families. The late 1970s was still an era when the five families of New York exerted enormous influence over New Jersey operations, and the FBI assumed that such a large-scale theft could not have occurred without mob sanction. Wiretaps were placed on known Gambino and Genovese associates, but no chatter about the heist emerged. This silence was itself suspicious. Such a major theft would normally generate rumors, boasting, disputes over shares. Instead, there was nothing, as though the underworld itself had closed ranks. Some agents speculated that Brennan had kept the operation so tight, involving so few men, that word never spread. Others feared a more unsettling possibility, that higher powers, perhaps even corrupt officials or corporate insiders, had an interest in keeping the truth buried. Meanwhile, O'Connor cracked under pressure. By October 1978, after 3 months of constant questioning, he was drinking heavily, calling in sick, and according to his wife, waking up in the middle of the night muttering about keys and timing. The FBI offered him a deal, full immunity in exchange for naming his co-conspirators. O'Connor denied everything, swore he was innocent, but his insistence only deepened suspicions. Then, in December, he attempted suicide, overdosing on pills before his wife found him unconscious and called an ambulance. He survived, but his health was permanently damaged, and he resigned from the facility in early 1979. To O'Donnell and his team, this was as close to a confession as they would ever get, but still no hard evidence tied him to Brennan or anyone else. The Justice Department refused to indict without something solid, and the case began to stall. The press, however, did not let it go. Local newspapers ran exposés about the vanishing millions of Newark, speculating on mob links, corrupt bankers, even suggesting CIA involvement, since some of the missing bearer bonds were rumored to be connected to overseas accounts used in covert operations. A 1980 magazine article quoted an unnamed source who claimed the heist had been staged to cover the disappearance of sensitive financial documents that implicated major Wall Street firms in laundering foreign money. Though never proven, these allegations added a layer of intrigue that has never fully dissipated. For Brennan, life after the heist was a mixture of paranoia and fleeting comfort. FBI surveillance from 1979 to 1981 documented him frequenting cheap diners, union halls, and occasionally vanishing for weeks at a time. He bought no flashy cars, no new houses, no obvious signs of sudden wealth. Yet in one chilling report, an informant claimed Brennan kept a padlocked trunk in the basement of a relative's home, a trunk he guarded obsessively. When agents finally raided the property in 1982, the trunk was gone. Whether it ever contained the stolen money, no one could prove. The second major twist of the investigation came in 1983, when a tip led agents to a warehouse in Jersey City. Inside, they found 3 empty armored transport bags matching the type used at the Newark facility. They were clean, no fingerprints, no residue, but their presence suggested the money had indeed been moved through there. The warehouse was leased under a false identity, traced back to a shell company linked to a cousin of Brennan's. Still, prosecutors argued it was circumstantial. A grand jury was convened in 1984, but without direct testimony or physical evidence, no indictments were handed down. The frustration within the FBI was palpable. One memo from O'Donnell simply read, "We are chasing ghosts." As the years passed, the case transformed from an active investigation into a legend. Younger agents studied it as a case study in perfect planning, older agents carried the bitterness of defeat. In 1987, O'Connor died of a heart attack at just 42, taking whatever knowledge he had to the grave. His funeral was sparsely attended, his reputation forever tainted by suspicion. Brennan, on the other hand, lived on, though increasingly paranoid. By the early 1990s, he was seen muttering to himself in bars, ranting that they'll never find it, though who they were was unclear. In 1994, he disappeared altogether. His last known address in Bayonne was found abandoned, dishes still in the sink, clothes in the closet, but no sign of him. Some believe he fled to Europe, others that he was silenced by the very people he once worked with. Officially, he is still listed as a missing person. From a modern perspective, with advances in forensic science and financial tracking, The Newark heist stands out for what it foreshadowed. In 2002, the FBI briefly reopened the case, running DNA tests on preserved evidence, including fragments of tape found in the vault. No matches were found. In 2005, digital analysis of the vault's security logs suggested minor anomalies, entries out of sequence, as if the system had been tampered with to erase certain timestamps. Yet again, this pointed to an inside accomplice with technical knowledge, a second person beyond O'Connor, someone never identified. Theories proliferated. Perhaps a technician contracted for alarm maintenance, perhaps a higher-ranking official who quietly vanished after the crime. The sealed FBI files, still partially classified, add weight to the suspicion that something bigger than mere robbery was at play. The psychological cost of the crime also left scars. Surviving guards gave interviews in the 1990s describing how their lives collapsed under suspicion. One, William Harris, confessed he contemplated suicide for years, convinced that no one believed his innocence. Families of employees drifted apart under the strain. Even investigators were haunted. O'Donnell retired in 1990, but in a rare interview before his death in 2001, he admitted, "It's not the money that bothers me. It's that someone beat us so cleanly. No trace. No mistakes. That doesn't happen in the real world unless someone up high wants it that way." As Part 2 closes, the Newark heist investigation stands unresolved, an open file that has outlived many of its participants. The stolen millions remain unspent, or at least untraced, leading some to believe they were never the true target. The fate of Brennan, the silence of O'Connor, the missing trunk, the erased security logs, all these fragments form a puzzle with missing pieces. And it is in this uncertainty, this unresolved tension, that the story gathers its power. For every document unearthed, another seems hidden. For every lead pursued, another wall rises. The Newark armored heist of 1978 remains, in the words of one agent, a crime that happened in plain sight, but one we were never allowed to see. What comes next is not merely about uncovering the truth of the stolen millions but about confronting the broader question. How much of what we think we know about this crime was real, and how much was engineered to keep us looking in the wrong direction? The answer may only emerge when the final pieces are forced into daylight, and that is where Part 3 will take us. The forest surrounding the abandoned house had grown darker as weeks passed, the branches closing overhead like hands trying to protect or conceal what stood beneath, and by the time the investigators returned with fresh leads and renewed determination, the place felt less like a ruin and more like a living witness resisting every attempt to expose its secrets. Yet they pressed on, cataloging the dust, the burn marks on the wooden floor, the strange arrangement of objects left behind, and each time they touched something it seemed to whisper of the 4 missing people who had lived unseen for those 2 lost months before being discovered here, frail, silent, and with memories shredded into fragments they could barely hold together, fragments that hinted at captivity, at bargains struck in desperation, at the quiet presence of someone else inside the house who was gone before rescue ever arrived. The files began to swell with contradictory testimonies, and each investigator privately wondered if the 4 had been complicit in their own vanishing or if they were pawns in a larger scheme, a scheme too carefully staged to be anything but deliberate. And so when local villagers came forward claiming they had seen movements in the woods, shadows slipping from tree to tree, muffled voices at night, the glow of a lantern where no one should have been, the theory that the house had been only one layer of the mystery grew stronger, and the search widened into the forest itself. Men combing through swamps, old paths, even hidden sinkholes, while the 4 survivors were kept in quiet rooms for questioning, their faces pale as if every question was a knife reopening wounds they wished to forget. But under pressure certain details emerged, one remembering the sound of boots dragging across the floor at night, another swearing she heard laughter echoing from the attic though no one ever climbed those stairs, and a third describing a smell of kerosene that never left the air. No matter how many windows were open, details that pulled the investigators deeper into a labyrinth where truth was scattered in pieces like broken glass, cutting whoever tried to fit them together. And then there were the objects recovered from the house. A rusted lockbox with nothing inside, photographs of unknown families tucked into the walls, scraps of maps drawn by hand with red lines crossing valleys and rivers pointing toward nowhere obvious. But the most troubling was a notebook written in alternating hands, pages filled with dates, strange calculations, and lists of items ranging from food supplies to tools that no one admitted to writing. Though handwriting analysis suggested at least one of the missing men had contributed to it, raising questions whether he had been trying to help his captors or simply documenting what was happening to them. Investigators kept their discoveries quiet from the press, aware that leaks could spark panic in the region, especially since rumors of organized groups operating deep in the forest had circulated for years, but the pressure from families of the missing, from townspeople who demanded answers, grew unbearable, and soon whispers spread faster than official reports. Whispers that the house had been a gathering place, that something darker than coincidence explained how 4 people could disappear on a mountain trip and end up here 100 kilometers away, gaunt and silent, unable to tell who had brought them and why. The forest patrol reported broken branches high up in the canopy, strange depressions in the soil, as if heavy equipment had been hauled through and removed, and though no clear tracks remained, the idea of a hidden route, a path known only to those who controlled it, kept resurfacing, while at night the survivors suffered dreams so vivid they would wake screaming, speaking of a figure with a lantern, always standing at the edge of the room, never approaching but never leaving, and when asked to draw what they had seen, their sketches were eerily similar: a tall shape with no discernible face, holding a round light that seemed more like a burning orb than a lamp, details too consistent to dismiss as coincidence, yet too vague to identify as any one person. Investigators debated whether trauma had fused their memories into one shared hallucination, or if indeed there was someone who had stalked them silently, unseen by all but their deepest fears. But whatever the truth, it became harder to shake. The feeling that the house had been a stage, set up not only for the captives but for whoever would eventually find them, a place designed to raise questions that could never fully be answered. And when specialists combed through the building with ground-penetrating equipment, they found signs of voids beneath the foundation, chambers long filled in or collapsed, and some argued that was where the captors had come and gone, hidden beneath the very floors where the survivors lay awake, listening, unable to escape. But digging yielded nothing but fragments of old wood and stones, and still the mystery clung to them, stronger than evidence, thicker than silence, until the lead investigator, worn and sleepless, confessed in private notes that he feared the house was only the beginning, that somewhere else in the forest other sites existed, waiting with their own prisoners, their own impossible stories, and that the truth, if it was ever uncovered, would not lead to closure but to something larger, something neither the families nor the nation was ready to confront. By the time autumn winds swept through the forest and stripped the branches bare, the case had become a silent obsession for everyone involved: the investigators, the families, even the townspeople who once tried to distance themselves from the tragedy but now found their daily conversations circling back to the house, the forest, and the question of how 4 adults could vanish during a mountain trip and reappear months later in a place that seemed built to confuse anyone searching for logic. The survivors themselves were shadows of their former lives, shells walking through days without expression, haunted by memories they could not share or would not dare to, and when doctors tried to coax out their experiences through therapy, hypnotic recall, or even experimental drugs, the results were the same: images of flickering lanterns, muffled voices in the walls, the sensation of being watched while they slept, all blending into a chorus of fear without origin or conclusion. And yet one of them, the older man of the group, finally whispered something different late one night when he was thought to be asleep, muttering about a door that was not a door, about being led through narrow tunnels where the air tasted of iron, where footsteps echoed endlessly. And though he awoke the next morning denying he had said anything, the nurses wrote it down and passed it along, giving investigators a new angle. For if tunnels existed, then perhaps the strange voids beneath the house had once connected to a larger system long buried, a system that could explain how their captors vanished without trace. Geological surveys were ordered, locals were interviewed again, but no one admitted to knowing about such passages, though elderly villagers recalled stories of wartime hideouts, smuggling routes, even shelters built into the earth by those who wished to disappear from governments or from debts. And the possibility that these ancient structures had been reactivated made the silence surrounding the house even more unbearable, as though the ground itself was complicit in hiding crimes. Meanwhile, scattered evidence emerged in strange places: an abandoned backpack discovered deep in the woods with no tracks leading to it, a half-burned ledger found in a hunter's shack containing lists of names that did not match anyone in town, and most chillingly, a set of photographs mailed anonymously to the investigator's office, showing the 4 missing people during their captivity, sitting in the very same rooms where they had later been found, but thinner, more frightened, and with blurred figures standing in the background, figures deliberately out of focus, their faces hidden as though the photographer had known how to preserve the terror while denying identity. The photos were analyzed, the paper traced, but nothing yielded an answer, and those who saw them could not shake the conviction that the captives had not been alone, that others had orchestrated everything. With precision, allowing them to live only long enough to be found and raise questions that would gnaw at everyone forever. At night, the lead investigator began dreaming of the house, standing empty in the moonlight, its windows reflecting shapes that were not there during the day, and he began to fear he was being drawn into the same cycle as the survivors, caught between reality and illusion, because when he returned to the site he noticed new disturbances, fresh boot prints in the mud. Cigarette stubs no one admitted to leaving, faint smells of smoke that should have dissipated long ago, proof that someone still came and went even after the place was sealed, as if maintaining it like a shrine. Yet when cameras were hidden nearby they captured only flickers of light in the distance, shapes darting too quickly to identify, and the recordings themselves developed strange static whenever the house came into view, forcing the team to wonder if tampering was involved or if the equipment itself failed under the weight of whatever forces lingered there. Then came the discovery that changed the tone of the investigation entirely. Beneath a loose floorboard in one of the rooms, a bundle of documents was found wrapped in cloth, damp but legible, containing handwritten notes in different languages, some in Russian, some in German, some in English, detailing movements of groups across borders, supply routes marked by coordinates, and cryptic references to the watchers who kept the fires lit. And while intelligence officials rushed to seize the find, rumors spread among the investigators that the 4 missing people had stumbled upon something much larger than themselves during their mountain trip, something that required them to be removed and studied, broken down and then returned in silence. But the survivors offered no confirmation, only blank stares when confronted, though one woman began to cry uncontrollably whenever the word "watcher" was spoken, and this reaction convinced some that the documents were authentic, that an organized presence had indeed used the house for operations, and that the captives were pawns in a shadow war no one wished to acknowledge publicly. Meanwhile, pressure from outside mounted, journalists demanded answers, conspiracy theorists flooded the region, some even camping near the forest in hopes of seeing the lantern figure for themselves, and each new rumor, each new sighting of moving lights, each scream in the woods at night seemed to braid itself into the official silence, weaving a legend that threatened to consume the truth entirely. Families of the survivors begged for closure, for the investigators to stop pushing, but the case had grown beyond individuals, becoming a mirror for fears the community had buried for decades, fears of hidden powers, secret pathways, and the realization that vanishing could happen to anyone anytime, without reason. Then, without warning, one of the survivors disappeared. Again, slipping from his guarded room in the middle of the night, leaving behind nothing but his clothes folded neatly on the bed and a piece of paper with 3 words scrawled, "Not finished yet," a phrase that sent shockwaves through the team and reignited every nightmare they had tried to suppress, because if he had been taken, it meant the captors still operated freely, but if he had gone willingly, it meant their hold over him was stronger than anyone realized, and in both cases the truth remained just out of reach, waiting like a flame at the edge of sight, always there, never close enough to touch. The disappearance of the survivor from his guarded room sent the entire investigation into chaos, and though every door and window had been locked from the inside, as if no human could possibly escape unnoticed, he was simply gone, leaving behind only that chilling note that read, "Not finished yet," a phrase that echoed through the minds of the investigators like a curse, and as they searched the hospital grounds, interviewed staff, and checked surveillance footage, they discovered that at the precise moment of his vanishing, all cameras covering the ward had gone dark for exactly 7 minutes, a blackout no technician could explain since the backup power systems had not failed, and even more unnerving was the fact that no other part of the building experienced the outage, suggesting someone had selectively manipulated only the feeds that mattered, and when footage resumed, there was nothing but the empty bed, the folded clothes and silence. Panic spread quickly, for the implication was clear. Whoever had orchestrated the original abduction was not only still at large but watching, waiting, and capable of reaching into supposedly secure places with impunity, and in the days that followed, strange signs appeared near the forest again, lantern lights drifting between the trees, voices caught on wind like echoes of conversations that stopped as soon as anyone drew closer, and prints in the soil that began at the edge of the woods but ended abruptly, as though Whoever left them had vanished into the air. Journalists swarmed the town, desperate for headlines, while conspiracy theorists declared the missing man had been called back to his captors, that his role in some unknown ritual or operation was not yet fulfilled. But among the investigators, grim determination replaced speculation, and they redoubled their efforts, pulling apart the old house piece by piece, digging beneath foundations, mapping every inch of forest paths. Yet the more they uncovered, the more contradictions piled up. Tunnels that seemed to lead somewhere but collapsed into nothing, maps that pointed to non-existent landmarks, fragments of burned documents with words like exchange, observers, and threshold, words that hinted at purpose but never enough to reveal it. And then came a revelation from one of the remaining survivors, the woman who had once wept at the mention of watchers, who now, after weeks of silence, suddenly spoke in a flat, detached voice, saying that the man who disappeared had not escaped but been taken through the second door, though when pressed she could not describe what that door looked like, only that it appeared when they wanted it to, and it was never in the same place twice, sometimes in the floor, sometimes in the wall, once even in the ceiling, a shifting aperture that made no sound but led them away for hours before returning them changed, exhausted, silent. And though this testimony seemed delusional, it was too eerily consistent with fragments mentioned by the older survivor who had spoken in his sleep of a door that was not a door, and suddenly investigators realized both had described the same impossible phenomenon from different perspectives. Official channels tried to bury these statements, branding them as products of trauma, but internally the team could not dismiss the possibility that hidden passages, perhaps mechanical in design, perhaps far stranger, had been used to move the captives in and out without leaving physical evidence. Driven by this, the lead investigator ordered a new search of the forest perimeter, and after 3 sleepless nights of combing through dense undergrowth, a hidden opening was found in the base of a hill 2 kilometers from the house, sealed with fresh boards that bore markings matching those found in the notebook beneath the floor, and when they pried it open, a shaft descended into darkness, air stale with the smell of damp earth and old smoke, and, for the first time they had something concrete, a physical passage that might explain the impossible movements. Yet descending into it proved nearly fatal as the structure was unstable, collapsing in parts, forcing them to crawl through mud and rubble until they reached a chamber carved crudely from rock, containing only ashes, broken lanterns, and what looked like makeshift beds. But on the wall, drawn in charcoal, were symbols resembling eyes, dozens of them, staring out in silence, and beneath them the words in shaky English, "We are never alone," a phrase that chilled even the most hardened officers. Photos were taken, evidence catalogued, but the chamber was sealed off for safety, though every man who entered it reported the same sensation of being watched, of hearing faint footsteps behind them that stopped whenever they turned. In the days after, nightmares plagued them, and 2 members of the team requested reassignment, unwilling to return to the site, while the lead investigator, despite exhaustion, pressed on, convinced they were on the verge of uncovering the truth. Then came another twist. An envelope delivered anonymously to the local police station, containing a map drawn with astonishing accuracy, marking not only the discovered chamber but several more across the forest, each linked by lines that formed a pattern resembling a network or web, with the old house at its center like a hub, and scribbled along the edges were warnings: "Do not enter at night, the watchers feed on silence," and most disturbingly, "One has returned," which investigators interpreted as a reference to the missing survivor, perhaps suggesting he was now part of those maintaining the network. Though half the team dismissed it as a cruel hoax, the other half could not ignore how the first marked location had already proven real, and so expeditions were planned for the others. But before they could begin, strange incidents swept through the town. Livestock found slaughtered in fields with no tracks around them, families reporting knocks on their doors at 3 in the morning only to find no one outside, and several children whispering about a tall man carrying a lantern who stood at the edge of their yards at night, watching, then fading into the dark, details too similar to the survivors' testimonies to be coincidence, and soon fear consumed the community, with some villagers fleeing entirely, others locking themselves inside after sundown, and whispers spread that the missing man had been seen among the trees, thinner than before, carrying a lantern, his eyes glowing like embers. The investigators, caught between disbelief and dread, knew the case had now grown beyond their control, for the forest no longer seemed like just a setting but an active presence, drawing them deeper into a web of disappearances, symbols, and unanswered questions. And though they pushed forward with determination, documenting every discovery. They could not shake the feeling that the phrase "not finished yet" had not been a threat but a promise, one that was still unfolding around them, step by step, dragging them all toward an end none of them could yet see but all of them feared. By the time the 6th month of the investigation arrived, what had begun as a case of 4 vanished hikers and an abandoned house in the woods had transformed into something far larger and far stranger. And though the official task force continued to operate under the pretense of uncovering a criminal network that used the forest as a cover for illegal operations, within closed doors even the most skeptical agents admitted that the evidence defied normal explanation, yet no one dared put such admissions on record for fear of ridicule or career suicide, so they pressed on, meticulously cataloging each finding, cross-referencing maps, interviewing townspeople who increasingly resisted cooperation out of fear, while whispers of curses and the watchers spread like wildfire through the community, dividing families between those who wanted the forest burned to the ground and those who warned such an act would provoke something far worse. The first of the new expeditions into the marked locations from the anonymous map commenced under heavy security, with armed escorts and portable generators brought to keep the sites illuminated at all times. But almost immediately the team encountered anomalies, equipment failures in areas where batteries drained unnaturally fast, GPS units looping coordinates as though the men were walking in circles even on straight paths, and radios that carried voices not belonging to any team member, faint whispers repeating names, sometimes even the names of the investigators themselves. The second chamber discovered was deeper, hidden beneath a collapsed well, and inside were not ashes but crates, empty save for shredded cloth, restraints and ledgers written in both English and a second language no linguist could definitively identify, though several pages contained columns of numbers that, when cross-referenced against financial archives, matched old bank deposits from the 1970s involving companies that no longer existed, suggesting the forest had once hidden not only captives but money laundering operations stretching back decades, possibly generations. Yet again the walls were decorated with eye symbols and this time a phrase in uneven scrawl. The silence marks them. Words that returned to haunt the investigators later when they discovered that every recorded interview with survivors had at some point been marred by inexplicable gaps of silence on the tape, as if entire sentences were swallowed mid-conversation. Then, during the excavation of a third site, one officer collapsed without warning, seizing violently before regaining consciousness and insisting he had seen someone standing behind the lead investigator, a man with a lantern who vanished as soon as he blinked. And though his account was dismissed as hallucination brought on by stress, the man's health deteriorated rapidly in the weeks that followed, and within a month he was dead from unexplained organ failure, a fact quietly redacted from public reports. Meanwhile the woman survivor grew increasingly unstable, alternating between long periods of silence and bursts of speech in which she repeated fragments of phrases like, "He is carrying it now," and "they cannot return empty-handed," statements so cryptic the team could make no sense of them, though her fixation on the missing man suggested she believed he had taken on a new role among the captors. As if to confirm this, fresh sightings of a tall figure with a lantern were reported near the edge of town, always silent, always disappearing before anyone could approach, and one grainy photograph taken by a farmer at dawn appeared to show a man with hollowed features and unnaturally sharp posture, though analysis could neither prove nor disprove its authenticity. The press, sensing the growing hysteria, dubbed him the Lantern Man, a figure that became both urban legend and nightly terror, yet the investigators could not ignore how closely the image resembled the missing survivor. Then came the most damning discovery. Beneath the floor of the abandoned house, deeper than the notebook chamber, they unearthed a vault sealed with steel plating, rusted but intact, requiring heavy machinery to breach, and when opened, the chamber revealed rows of filing cabinets containing hundreds of files, each detailing individuals who had vanished across several states over nearly 50 years, their names, dates, and sometimes photographs meticulously preserved, yet no record of these files existed in any federal or local database, raising chilling questions about how such information had been compiled and why it had been hidden here. Worse still, several of the files corresponded to people whose disappearances had never been reported publicly, as if they had been erased before anyone outside a closed circle knew they were gone, and among the files was one marked with the lead investigator's own surname, though the page within was blank except for a single phrase, "Not yet," which left him shaken to the core and unable to sleep, haunted by the sense that someone had anticipated his involvement years before he was even assigned the case. Forensic teams transported the files to secure storage, but within days portions of the archive were missing, replaced with blank folders, despite guards posted around the clock and no trace of forced entry, just gaps where key evidence should have been. The implication was unbearable. Either someone within the team was sabotaging them, or the same unseen presence that had stolen the survivor from the hospital was now operating inside their most secure facilities. Panic and suspicion divided the task force, with accusations of betrayal flying back and forth, friendships collapsing, and the once united team splintering into factions, some convinced they were fighting a human conspiracy of staggering reach, others certain they were up against something beyond human explanation. And in the midst of this paranoia, another message arrived, a small box left at the police station with no fingerprints, containing a lantern identical to those found in the chambers, still warm as though recently lit, and a note inside. "The circle closes soon," words that suggested an approaching climax. Nights in the town grew unbearable as power outages struck without warning, animals wailed at nothing visible, and a low hum, almost mechanical, was heard deep in the forest, vibrating through the ground, sometimes so strongly that windows rattled, yet no source was ever found. Finally, desperate, the lead investigator authorized one last expedition, gathering what remained of his fractured team, determined to locate the central hub of the network suggested by the anonymous map, a site at the very heart of the forest marked only with the symbol of a single unblinking eye. After hours of pushing through dense terrain, they came upon a clearing unlike any other, perfectly circular, devoid of vegetation, with scorched soil and a faint smell of ozone, as if lightning had struck repeatedly for years, and at its center a stone structure no one had ever recorded before, a crude monolith carved with the same eye symbols and words in several languages repeating one phrase,